Under two separate videos about the Queen Mother's household, two different subjects, two different narrations, generating two separate comment threads, viewers typed versions of the same sentence. Neither video had mentioned Prince Andrew. The scripts covering Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon ran for nearly 40 minutes combined, describing her staff, her residences, and the conduct that people who worked for her eventually described when they got around to describing it at all. Andrew's name appeared in neither narration, not once. The viewers supplied him. They supplied him in almost identical language. One commenter wrote, "The old girl trained Andrew well." A second wrote that she was as arrogant as Andrew. A third, "She is definitely Andrew's grandma." A fourth, "Andrew takes after her." Comment after comment, across both threads, none of the writers apparently aware of the others, all arriving at the same pairing independently. Commenters reached for Andrew, under videos that never gave them a reason to, and they reached for him with nearly identical words. When strangers arrive at the same comparison without being led there, they aren't being clever. They are recognizing something structural. And what they were recognizing, without quite naming it, is the subject of this video. Here is what the people who worked for the Queen Mother said about her. And here, beside it, is what the people who worked for Andrew said about him. Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon was born on 4th August 1900 in London. She was the 9th of 10 children of Claude Bowes-Lyon, then Lord Glamis, and from 1904 the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, and his wife, Cecilia Cavendish Bentinck. Her childhood divided between St. Paul's Waldenbury in Hertfordshire and Glamis Castle, the ancestral Strathmore seat in Angus, Scotland. By around the age of 4, Glamis was home. The siblings, Violet, who died of diphtheria aged 11 in 1893, before Elizabeth was born, Mary, Patrick, John, Alexander, Fergus, killed at the Battle of Luce in 1915, Rose, Michael, Elizabeth, then David, born 2 years after her. She entered a family that was large, Edwardian, titled, and organized around a household grammar that preceded her consciousness of the world by years. Think about that for a moment. You're carrying laundry down a corridor at Glamis Castle. A child approaches, the daughter of the family, no more than 5 years old. The rules of this household, like the rules of virtually every comparable aristocratic establishment in Britain at the time, require you to turn aside, to make yourself an absence in the passage until she is passed. She doesn't acknowledge you. She doesn't need to. The arrangement exists precisely so that she doesn't need to. The documentary record of Edwardian country house service is specific about this. Household instruction texts from the period stated that servants should never offer any opinion to their employers, nor even to say good morning or good night, except in direct reply to a salutation. Period accounts of the country house servant's life document the expectation that staff would turn away or become physically unobtrusive when the family passed. The PBS documentary project on Edwardian manor house life records a formal servants' code that extends the principle. Never speak to an employer unless spoken to, never presume on the family's attention, never make your presence felt as the presence of a person with equivalent claim on the space. Architectural histories of the era confirm that separate staircases for staff and family, servants' halls removed from all family rooms, meals taken apart, and movement organized so that the machinery of the house was present, but invisible to the people it served, were the standard features of houses built and managed the way Glamis was managed. Glamis had this. The castle has medieval origins, extensively rebuilt, with multiple staircases documented in its histories. The major turnpike stair used by the family, the older, narrower passages used by retainers. Servants' bedrooms were in the garret rooms. The physical separation of staff from family wasn't incidental to the architecture. It was built into it, in stone, a century before Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon arrived. What was particular about one child growing up inside this wasn't the rules themselves. Those were general and unremarkable for that world. What was particular was that those rules preceded her capacity to think about them. She absorbed the grammar of the aristocratic household before she had the language to name it as a grammar. The footmen existed. The housemaids appeared when needed and vanished afterward. The corridor emptied before she reached it. The bell was answered. These weren't lessons she learned. They were the texture of life as it presented itself to her from its earliest legible moments. The physical structure of the world, as comprehensible and unremarkable as the Scottish weather. Her siblings experienced the same environment. Her mother Cecilia was described, by people who knew the household, as astute, wise, and kind, someone the servants liked. The world Elizabeth absorbed at Glams wasn't cruel in intent. It was ordinary, by the standards of its class and its era. And what ordinary meant was that the comfort of the family was the organizing principle of every person employed there, and that any acknowledgement of this service was entirely at the family's discretion. Not a servant's right, not a servant's entitlement to negotiate, and not a subject that required discussion. A child who grows up inside that system does not acquire a philosophy. She acquires an expectation. She married Prince Albert, Duke of York, at Westminster Abbey on 26 April 1923. She was 22. Their early married life moved through White Lodge in Richmond Park and then 145 Piccadilly in London, both properties carrying their own household staffs. The abdication of Edward VIII in December 1936 made Albert king as George VI and relocated the household to Buckingham Palace as its principal London residence. She could feel genuine admiration for her staff in extremity. The admiration and the underlying expectation of total service weren't in conflict. They coexisted comfortably because the expectation was ambient. It was the structure of the relationship, not a demand she had to make. After George VI's death in February 1952, Elizabeth became Queen Mother. She moved from Buckingham Palace to Clarence House as her London residence, established from 1953. She described Clarence House to those around her as a little big house. Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park became her Windsor Country Retreat, used continuously after her husband's death. She purchased Castle of May in Caithness, Scotland in 1952, spending typically 3 weeks there in August and returning for about 10 days in October each year. She used Burke Hall on the Balmoral estate seasonally. 4 simultaneous residences, each fully staffed, each running in parallel for 50 years. The grammar didn't change. The surface area expanded. Clarence House, by later documentary accounts, employed roughly 50 people at any given time. Housekeepers, butlers, footmen, pages, chefs, equerries, ladies-in-waiting, dressers, gardeners, chauffeurs, and a watchman who sat outside her bedroom door through the night. The end of each evening was communicated through a code phrase. When the Queen Mother was preparing for bed, word passed through the household. "Auntie has her hand on the Fabergé." Staff throughout the building adjusted accordingly. No direct instruction required. The phrase was enough, because everyone in the building already understood what it meant. And the understanding itself was a product of years of service in a household where the employer's rhythms were the organizing principle of everyone else's schedule. Royal household employees sign a formal undertaking of confidentiality, a deed separate from and additional to their standard employment contract. This has been a condition of royal employment for decades. It's the structural mechanism that kept testimony about what it was actually like to work for the Queen Mother arriving so slowly, at such distance, through so many intermediaries, most of it emerging only after the principal was dead, the events were decades old, and the sources had calculated that speaking was safer than staying silent. Tom Quinn, a British journalist and royal biographer, published Backstairs Billy, The Life of William Tallon, the Queen Mother's most devoted servant, in 2015, through Robson Press, a bite-back imprint. The book draws on testimony from former servants and associates of William Tallon, who had entered royal service around 1951 during the reign of George VI, and remained as the Queen Mother's page of the backstairs for over 50 years. Tallon received Royal Victorian medals in 1975, 1996, and 2001. He died in 2007 of liver failure, and his funeral was held at the Queen's Chapel, St. James's Palace, in December of that year. Quinn is transparent about his method. "For good or ill," he writes in the book's introduction, "I agreed to these requests for anonymity, or for a change of name, for without them this book couldn't have been written." He drew on former fellow servants, friends, and associates of Tallon. What he assembled from those sources includes a description of Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's relationship to domestic service that applies equally to the beginning and the end of her life. She found it difficult, Quinn writes, to imagine a world where servants didn't. The clause trails in the available text, but its direction is unambiguous. A woman who had never in her life been in a room without someone whose function was to serve her didn't experience this as privilege. She experienced it as the way rooms are. Both stories are warm. They matter precisely because they are warm, because they describe something the straightforward, "she was awful to her staff" reading consistently fails to account for. She was capable of genuine charm, genuine self-deprecation, and genuine affection with people she had decided to include within a particular radius of personal familiarity. That warmth wasn't a performance, it was real. The demand for absolute compliance and the capacity for genuine warmth aren't contradictions. They are the exact combination that makes a particular kind of authority sustainable for a century, because the warmth makes the expectation invisible, not to the people answering it, but to everyone observing from outside. And everyone observing from outside had agreed, through press culture and formal confidentiality undertakings and accumulated social deference, not to look too carefully. The official alternative to the staff accounts was William Shawcross's Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, the official biography, commissioned by Queen Elizabeth II in 2003, with full access to the royal archives and the Queen Mother's personal papers. Published by Macmillan in 2009, running to approximately 1,096 pages. Tristram Hunt described it in The Guardian as indulgent, overlong, and ultimately unsatisfying. Multiple reviewers characterized it as reverential in tone and largely uncritical. It had every primary source available to it. The portrait it produced was one the staff accounts don't recognize. 3 characterizations from those who knew her name, the gap between the public portrait and the more complicated reality. Harold Nicholson called her the greatest queen since Cleopatra. Cecil Beaton called her a marshmallow made on a welding machine. Stephen Tennant, who knew her personally, offered the most precise formulation. She looked everything that she wasn't. Gentle, gullible, tenderness mingled with dispassionate serenity, cool, well-bred, remote. Behind this veil she schemed and vacillated, hard as nails. A Windsor Castle guard described her, in documentary commentary, as a nasty piece of work. Buckingham Palace dismissed Tom Quinn's portrait of her later years, built from servant testimony, as scurrilous, wrong, and insulting. The palace was notably more confident about what the portrait got wrong than it was specific about what it got right. On 15 September 2009, journalist Tanya Gold published a piece in The Guardian titled "The Queen of Unkindness." It appeared in response to the Shawcross biography. The paper noted Gold's argument that the Queen Mother's cruelty, both to the little people and her own family, deserved acknowledgement rather than further burial. Gold was writing editorial. The Queen of Unkindness was a journalist's assessment, not an archival label. But it named something the Shawcross pages had smoothed over, and it appeared in a mainstream newspaper 3 days after the authorized biography hit shelves, which suggests the authorized portrait wasn't universally convincing even on arrival. She died on 30 March 2002 at Royal Lodge, Windsor, aged 101. Queen Elizabeth II and her niece Margaret Rhodes were present. The press coverage was, as a Prospect magazine essay described it that year, reverential, largely uncritical. The staff accounts that complicated the approved portrait arrived afterward, through Quinn, through Vickers, through Gold, through documentary makers, most of them working with sources constrained by undertakings, at the distances those undertakings were designed to create. Andrew was 42 years old when she died. Prince Andrew, Albert Christian Edward Mountbatten Windsor, was born on 19 February 1960 at Buckingham Palace. He was the Queen Mother's maternal grandson. His mother, Queen Elizabeth II, was her elder daughter. He is the third of the Queen's 4 children, her second son. The Queen Mother didn't raise him, didn't govern his education, and didn't run his household. She lived for 42 of his years. The argument here isn't personal tutelage. The argument is about what happens when someone absorbs a household grammar entirely, through proximity, observation, and a lifetime inside the institutions that ran on it, and then expresses it in a century that had stopped agreeing to accept it as natural. His first independent household began at Sunninghill Park, a 12-bedroom house near Ascot in Berkshire, completed around 1990 following his 1986 marriage to Sarah Ferguson. He and Sarah divorced in 1996, but continued sharing the property. In 2003, Andrew signed a 75-year lease on Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park from the Crown Estate, committing to what ultimately totaled several £1 million in premium and refurbishment costs. He moved in during 2004. Sunninghill Park sold in 2007. Royal Lodge had been the Queen Mother's Windsor country retreat since 1952. She used it continuously until her death in 2002. He occupied the same property, employed domestic staff to maintain it, and brought with him a set of expectations about how that relationship works. Expectations whose structural logic was identical to the one she had carried there decades before him. Charlotte Briggs, a named former maid, gave an account of being summoned to close curtains that had been left with a narrow gap. She put on evening dress before going up. She ran up 4 flights of stairs. When she arrived, the gap remained. Andrew, according to Briggs, emerged from the room screaming, "Can't you f***ing do anything right?" She left in tears and, by her account, feeling humiliated. The events she described occurred sometime in the 1990s. Her account was published approximately 25 years later. The curtains also had to be opened each morning. Andrew Lowney's biography, entitled The Rise and Fall of the House of York, published in 2025 after 4 years of research and hundreds of interviews with former staff and associates, reports that Andrew expected maids to climb 4 flights of stairs each morning to open his bedroom curtains. He was physically capable of opening them himself. The point wasn't incapacity. The point was that opening them was what the staff were there for. Paul Page served on the Royal Protection Command from 1998 to 2004. He gave detailed on-camera testimony in a 2022 ITV documentary. He described Andrew as overbearing and verbally abusive, and he described the teddy bear collection in specific operational terms. Approximately 50 to 60 bears, arranged according to a laminated diagram that staff were required to reproduce correctly. If the arrangement was wrong, Page said, Andrew would shout and scream, and become verbally abusive toward the maids responsible. The diagram was the standard. Deviation from it was unacceptable. The bears needed to be in their correct positions, and people who got them wrong were shouted at. Lowney also reports that Andrew required staff to bow or curtsy when he entered a room. If they didn't, he would leave and re-enter, then address the room. "Let's try that again." Former equerry Colin Burgess, named in reporting by multiple outlets, described a command style built around the phrase, "Do it." alongside bare imperatives, timed demands, and outright orders delivered to people who weren't in a position to question them. He called Andrew a rude, ignorant sod. And then he said something analytically central. The Queen Mother, along with King Charles, he stated explicitly, treated staff as human beings. He drew this contrast directly, as a man who had served in proximity to multiple royal households and who knew from experience what the comparison meant. The contrast does not dissolve the comparison. It explains the mechanism that made her version of the same underlying expectations so much harder to document for so much longer. She delivered those expectations through warmth, charm, ritual, and a particular kind of aristocratic ease, a manner that made compliance feel almost chosen rather than required. The gilly, she told, "You remind me of my husband," was inside a radius of genuine affection. The maids who answered the bell at 3 in the morning were answering a structural expectation that predated any personal feeling about them specifically. Both were true simultaneously. The warmth made the expectation ambient. He delivered the same expectation as what it actually was, a demand. The demand was the same. The delivery method determined which version the press found interesting, which version the staff found bearable, and which version entered the historical record as respectable household management, rather than as conduct requiring documentation and named sources and a 2022 ITV documentary. Valentine Lowe's Courtiers, The Hidden Power Behind the Crown, published by Headline in 2022, documents Andrew's conduct with senior palace officials and advisors. An unnamed senior courtier described him as not easy to deal with, very arrogant indeed, someone who lashed out and was very rude to advisors like me. In July 2005, at Hillsborough Castle in Northern Ireland, Andrew reportedly berated David Anderson, then his head of household, named in Lowney's reporting, for referring to the Queen Mother in conversation rather than by her formal title. Andrew called Anderson a f***ing imbecile and ordered him out of the room. Andrew, defending the protocols of a dead woman's household, behaving in exactly the manner she had spent a century keeping invisible. Dickie Arbiter, former Royal Protection Officer, on camera. Arrogant, rude, bumptious. British MPs, on the public parliamentary record. A rude, arrogant, and entitled man. Lowney reports that Andrew had a staff member removed because he reportedly couldn't stand the sight of a mole on the man's face, and another transferred for wearing a nylon tie. These specifics appear in multiple outlets, drawing on entitled and Quinn's yes ma'am, both relying on sources who requested anonymity. They aren't independently confirmed through primary documentation. They are the kind of granular, particular detail that tends to persist in staff networks because it's too specific to be useful as invention. By 2021, a job advertisement circulated publicly for Royal Lodge housemaids. The listed duties: packing and unpacking luggage, pressing clothes, caring for jewelry, running baths, drawing curtains, running errands. The pay attracted public comment. The duties, in structural terms, were indistinguishable from what had been expected of comparable staff at Clarence House under the Queen Mother and at Royal Lodge under the Queen Mother before Andrew's tenancy, and at Glamis Castle under Claude Bowes-Lyon's household in the early years of the 20th century. The same job, the same organizing principle, a different century, and no longer any cultural agreement that this was simply how things were done. What the two sets of accounts share isn't cruelty as a personality trait. It's a prior assumption that the comfort of the employer is the organizing principle of every person in the building, that the needs of the staff are a scheduling variable rather than a human claim, that the hierarchy is permanent and self-evident and requires no acknowledgement because acknowledging it would imply it could be otherwise. Both figures operated from this assumption. Both expressed it in ways legible in staff testimony. The difference isn't in the assumption. The difference is in how and when the assumption became visible. She had protections he didn't. The most durable was cultural. For the better part of the 20th century, the British press operated around the Queen Mother in a register of sustained deference so habitual it had ceased to feel like a choice and become an instinct. The Shawcross biography, with its 1,096 pages and its full archive access, produced a portrait reviewers called reverential and uncritical. The accounts that complicated that portrait arrived through biographers working with confidentiality-constrained sources, sometimes decades after the described events. The staff who knew what the household was like from the inside had signed a formal undertaking of confidentiality before they arrived, and that undertaking governed what they could say, to whom, and under what conditions. The culture outside had agreed, without formal negotiation, to accept the portrait the institution offered. She was fluent in the household grammar for 101 years. It cost her nothing. The press agreed not to notice. The staff agreed not to speak. The authorized biography ran to 1,096 sympathetic pages. When accounts that departed from the approved portrait appeared, the palace described them as scurrilous and insulting. She died at Royal Lodge in 2002, having lived entirely within the protection that grammar provided. The protection of an era that understood how to maintain the proposition that households run this way because everyone in them finds it agreeable. Andrew's hold on that protection lasted roughly 30 years after he established an independent household in 1990. His conduct toward staff began entering the public record through named, on-camera sources in a 2022 documentary describing events from the 1990s and 2000s. He didn't have a press culture that had agreed to look away. He didn't have the warmth and ritual to make his expectations ambient rather than overt. He didn't have the 100-year institutional weight that made the Queen Mother's version of the same underlying demands feel like the natural order of things, rather than the specific preferences of a specific, demanding person. He had the expectations, in a century that had stopped agreeing to be weather. Nothing about his conduct represents a personal invention. The certainty that the room arranges itself to you, the assumption that the function of everyone in the building is to maintain your comfort, the expectation that compliance is the texture of the world, not the outcome of a negotiation that the other party might be entitled to effect. All of it was standard issue in the house where his grandmother learned to be a person. Standard issue in every house she occupied afterward. Standard issue in the culture that produced both of them, and that protected one for long enough that the question of what kind of protection she needed never had to be asked publicly. She was fluent in that grammar for 101 years, and it never cost her a thing, because the press had agreed not to notice, and the staff had agreed not to speak. He inherited the grammar and lost the protection. He isn't the exception to that family. He is the last one to use the old language in public, in a century that had finally started listening.